Birnie. Jonathan and his family live at Dungannon, which is about 40 miles from here. He works as Head of Agriculture and Research for Dunbear, a large red meat processor. And Jonathan is going to talk to us about facilitating change within the red meat chain through knowledge transfer, feedback, and technology uptake. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I should say it kind of feels strange to be coming to what is the end of what's been a really rewarding period of my life, and it's strange to be standing up there and saying that, but I've really enjoyed Nuffield. And I have to say, firstly, thanks to my wife and family, who ultimately put up with 14 weeks of me being away in 1 year. And I enjoyed it. I'm not sure my wife did all the time. But I also have to thank the Nuffield Trust for what has been very, very rewarding. I also want to thank my sponsor, which was the Worshipful Company of Butchers, for their generosity, and also Bob Bansbach, who represented them and has been a tremendous help to me over the 2 years of this programme. I've really enjoyed working with him and appreciated him, so thank you very much. So I don't know about you, but I kind of get very, very frustrated at our industry. It's all doom and gloom. It's never good. We're all miserable. And actually, I don't think it's right. I think there's a lot of reason for excitement and, just optimism about the future, but it is frustrating because things do need to change. Change is necessary, and actually it's obvious that we have to do it. And the really frustrating bit is this. I listen to a lot of feedback, not all of it happy and positive, about people talking to me. Oh, have I disappeared? There we go. All right, people talking to me really about the problems that they have, but there are so many simple, practical solutions that can be applied, but they aren't. So why? And perhaps more importantly, what can we do about it? Firstly, I think we must focus on the customer, because that's what we're doing. If we want profitable businesses, we need to do what the customer wants. And very briefly, ultimately, the customer wants consistency, know what they're getting. They want a known quality, so whatever they pay for, they get. And lastly, they want value. It doesn't always be about price. A lot of it is about quality, as Richard has already talked about, but they want value. It's worth paying for what I've actually paid for. Just show you a couple of examples then of the lack of consistency in our supply chain. This is the difference between a 4L carcass and a 3 and a 2 for a lamb at 18 kilos, and we get maybe 20% of those 4Ls. Complete waste, not necessary. Perhaps more importantly then on beef, the loin actually on the right-hand side, as you look at it there, is actually physically worth less as a whole than the other two, even though they're smaller, because they're not suitable for market, and they have to go to somewhere that pays less. And to me, that's an inefficiency that could be cut out. And again, back to some of the comments that Richard was making about smaller animals and more efficient production. And a comment that I got from a processor in Australia actually was that I used to work in engineering. We would only tolerate 0.3% variation. But at the minute, we're tolerating 40% livestock. Why should we do that? And I felt he had a very fair point. So ultimately, who, what, where, why, where did I go, and who did I talk to? Well, firstly, I talked to a lot of people outside agriculture, not for any deliberate reason, but it was just interesting talking to different sectors. And some of the most interesting sectors there, I talked to a number of psychologists, I talked to a number of educators, did some charity visits as well, and as well as obviously the agriculture thing. Really interesting. And some of the most interesting stuff was outside, but directly applicable. And there were some very practical visits and some conferences. And I went to some really good conferences, actually, which were very helpful. Did North America, visited China, New Zealand, Australia, maybe a couple of times, bits and pieces in Europe. But it was very enlightening. But the thing that struck me more than anything else, it wasn't about the places, it was about the people. And they were inspiring. That's all I can say. Just for interest's sake, more than anything else, one of those is a farmers' extension event in Scotland, and one of them's an extension event in New Zealand. Kind of hard to tell the difference, actually. And it's although you'd only get that in 1 day in Scotland, obviously, but there you go. But to the heart of my topic, really now, Phil Hadley from the HDB summed this up, but a number of other people raised this. Fear of learning is a massive problem in agriculture. Massive. And then that's linked, obviously, to a lack of application. So I started going to, how do we learn? talked to educators, I talked to psychologists, educational psychologists, and ultimately come up with this. And I know it's not rocket science, but there we go. People learn in different ways. A lot of people like interactive learning, particularly farmers, getting in there, doing it, seeing what's going on, really important. Other people work well with one-to-one advice. Other people like discussional learning. Probably a lot of Nuffield actually like that. Other people just like seeing something done. That's where YouTube and the likes of that there actually come in quite handy sometimes. And lastly, and this is probably a minority, but some people thrive in a classroom environment where there's spoken and verbal learning. But the interesting thing about farmers is this here. Many of them had very little interest in academic study and therefore failed in formal education and now completely lack confidence in their ability to learn, which is absolutely untrue. And one of the things the psychologists really pulled out was that how people see themselves really affects just how they even learn. So, oh, I couldn't do that, I can't learn that, I don't do computers, I can't do this, and you get the general impression. But one of the really key things was when I visited a charity, it's actually a charity I'm a trustee of, but I spent a bit of time going through, working with some of the guys who really struggle, have a very difficult backgrounds. But whenever you put them in the right learning format, they learn and they go forward, even from a very, very disadvantaged background. And the key message there is everyone can learn. It just depends on what your style is. It must be an appropriate style. So that was really key to me in my job in Dunbea, as I am involved with farmers and trying to get change and trying to make things happen. I need to understand that. Very, very important. Not rocket science, but important. Here's the other thing, I think we all know this. Education doesn't necessarily change behaviour. Just because you know speeding isn't necessarily a good thing doesn't mean you ain't going to do it. And it's just worth bearing that in mind. And a headmaster said that, but I think we all know that. But that then moved on to, okay, say we get the education piece right, why then don't we change? And then talking to change management specialists and all the rest of the psychologists again, they were very clear that there's 5 or 6 points in the whole process of change. And the first thing is this here, pre-contemplation. Lovely word, but it actually just means that the people or the person doesn't realise the need to change. So we have a lot of farms that don't measure, they don't manage, they don't compare, they just don't do anything, and they just go doing what they always did. And they're always going to be in that stage, unless something jars them out of that. And we have a responsibility to do that. The second stage is actually when people become aware of problems and they realise the need for change. And this might come after seeing something or measuring something, but getting that measurement in is really, really important, and the comparison. Then we're moving really to where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, where we get to preparation, where a person accepts responsibility to change their behaviour and plans for change, and then they go looking for information, they go looking for help, and they try and bring in assistance from elsewhere. And then we get to action, where people are consciously choosing that new behaviour and techniques, and it takes effort. And then you have to go to the maintenance stage where you're keeping it going, and it still takes effort. And then lastly, you get to the termination stage, which sounds ominous, but isn't really. It's just, it's part of your natural practice, and you do it, and therefore you move on to something else. And I think understanding those stages is important, because change can be derailed at any of those points. If you fail to get the knowledge, if you fail to have the confidence, if you fail to measure, if you don't have somebody on your back just helping you to do it and holding you to account, it isn't going to happen. So there's no simple solution to moving things forward. It's a holistic approach that is needed, and it certainly made me rethink what I'm doing. And here's a really key thing. Sheep are up there for a reason, because predictability is much more important to us than anybody actually realises. And sometimes actually in us we subconsciously choose a bad outcome as opposed to an unknown. So therefore we have to fight. It's an effort. We're programmed to stay the same, and we need to change that. The other one was that the complexity of change just scares people. So if we're going to make change, we need to make it simple steps and a view of where we're going, and we'll touch on that very quickly in a minute. But a couple of the interesting case studies I did was, one of the things was a headmaster, a friend of mine actually, who was headmastering a school very close to here, which I'm not going to identify for reasons you're about to find out. But it's a very difficult area where kids are coming in with low IQs and parents who have no interest whatsoever in their education. And he came into the school, it was massively in the red, staff problems, behaviour problems, underperforming, and then being ranked against good schools and falling further behind. And he sat down and said, what do I do about this? And he got to the root of the problem. And he started to see the parents' attitude was probably one of the most important things. So he started into that, and he took a class, and he suddenly found out, okay, that class Only 2 of those parents had ever read to their children. None of them had ever played a board game with their kids. And ultimately what he did then was to start evenings where he got them involved and did that and brought them along, and eventually over time giving kids confidence that they could learn and support from their parents. It got to the point where actually they were overperforming against their IQ. And therefore, the encouragement was good. And interestingly enough, one of his pupils, who was very grateful, offered to make Christmas cheaper for him. If he would just give him his Christmas list, he would take it to the shoplifter. And I actually said, do you enjoy this job? He says, yes, I do. He says, I just get tired of the death threats. So that's why I'm not identifying it. Yeah. Second one was this, just very quickly. This was a conference speaker, but I then went and bought his book, and it was exceptional, one of the best books I've ever read. But he took an underperforming ship in the US Navy and worked with the same staff and crew who'd been, generally speaking, rubbish, and put a bit of confidence into them, and encouraged them when they did well, and gave them access to him, and worked on, and saw a vision of where he could be, and he turned it into the highest performing ship there had ever been in the US Navy. Simply by simple steps of trusting staff, working with them, encouraging them, correcting, being alongside and being approachable. So there's a lesson there too as well, but that confidence is crucial. He said the most important thing a captain can do is to see a ship through the eyes of its crew. So when you're making change in your farm, what does the cowman think when he's down there? What's the effect on him when this happens or that happens or the other happens? Getting it at ground level, really, really important. So what are the tools of change? And we're moving towards the end now. Research is very important, but the thing that came across time and time again, research has to be grounded in practical problems highlighted by farmers and advisors, and it must be planned with an implementation plan. There's a lot of research goes on that just isn't needed at the minute. And therefore, if there's an implementation plan at the start, it's much more likely to go through. The knowledge transfer is important, and it is really important to have farmers involved in the process of research and transferring the information. But one of the points that came across very strongly, the person is really important, even rather than just whether they're a farmer or not. If you have a real enthusiast, a really good practical type of guy, hands-on getting stuff across, it makes a real difference as well. So the person is really important in the knowledge transfer. Then we move on to the measurement and feedback, and when we talk about meat eating quality and we talk about farm performance and we talk about this, if we don't measure it, we can't manage it. Feedback's essential, and this is where we get to the technology bit very, very quickly. Technology has to be used to make life simpler or better. It must be used to provide ongoing feedback, but it must just work. Simple as that there. Last couple of points then. Science can set the standards, but it can't change behaviour. So that lies down to us. So why don't we change effectively? One, and this is controversial, some people are just lazy. They don't like the idea of changing, they won't do it. Simple as. Others lack knowledge, confidence, vision of where the business could be. Some lack the measurement feedback, some lack accountability. We can address all of those. But what am I going to do? From the last slide. Firstly, in my extension and message going out, I'm going to tailor learning to the farm and the person and to groups and to specific types of groups, and I'm going to look at how we work and educate and provide information and provide encouragement and provide confidence. The second thing is I'm going to be much simpler in what I do. I have a tendency to overcomplicate, but we need to simply measure. We need to give people a vision of where they could be. We need to be clear with them where they need to be, and we need to again give them the confidence that they can do it. And lastly, technology is essential, but it must just work. No complication, it just works, no fuss. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay.